Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
And hello again, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us. Another glowing report from the Arkansas State Treasury, another month of record or near-record tax collections. Further evidence of a strong economy, a vibrant recovery. But if revenues exceed expectations or above forecasts, can that momentum be sustained, and for how long? Inflation, fuel prices, how big a bite? War in Eastern Europe, what impact here? And will U.S. monetary policy dampen business and consumer optimism? And what's the outlook for the Arkansas farm sector? Questions for this week's edition and this week's panel. Dr. Mervin Jebaraj, Director of the Center of Business and Economic Research at the U of A. Dr. Jeremy Horpedahl, Associate Professor of Economics at UCA. And George Jared, Northeast Arkansas Bureau Chief of Talk, Business, and Politics. Gentlemen, thanks to all for coming in. Mervin, let's begin with you. As you assess the economy, state and national, and of course they're intertwined, what do you look at? What pops up first? What leaps out at you?
I think the headline unemployment rate is what pops up first. I think, if we looked at our path from the last recession to how we've dealt with this recession, the dramatic decline in the headline unemployment rate has been pretty good. It might get revised away, but it's currently at a record low of 3.1%. But besides that, I'd look at, labor force participation rate, which is 2 percentage points lower than where we were before we went into the pandemic. And we think some of that labor force participation could improve with childcare situation improving or people unretiring. But we think a larger component of that is likely not going to improve, with labor force participation rate going to remain fairly lower because a lot of people did retire during the pandemic and are likely not returning to work because that was when they planned to retire anyway.
Right. Look, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think that the unemployment rate is certainly one of the important variables to look at. But also, if we look at the employment data from the Survey of Businesses, that's actually at record highs in Arkansas as well. So I looked at that, the revenue collection data, Steve, that you mentioned, the fact that that's so high, especially the sales tax collection data has been so high. It's an indication that consumers are coming back and spending money. And so those are all very bullish signs, I think, as I look at the economy.
Okay, and up in Georgia, Northeast Arkansas, especially not only there, but especially there, you're looking at the farm economy as well.
Yeah, we've got a couple of factors that are dominating the ag sector up here, in Northeast Arkansas this time of year. The war in Ukraine, there's a lot of side effects. A lot of people talk about fuel prices, which is a big input cost for farmers. Those obviously have been on the rise for, the better part of 6 months or longer, and they continue to rise because of that. Another problem we have is that, there's a lot of fertilizers are produced in Belarus, which is one of, Russia's biggest allies, and some of those supply chain lines have been shut down, and specifically potash, which is used as a fertilizer. So those input costs are going up significantly because of that. And another problem that we have here, I've talked to several scientists about this, this season already, beyond all of the expanded input costs that were going to be a problem for farmers, weeds. They're always a problem for farmers, but for whatever reason, this year is going to be a particularly bad year for weeds. And so that's just going to add to input costs. It's going to more than likely drag yields down. Farmers are going to have to make decisions as to whether they're going to farm some of their fields.
Well, let's stay with that for just a second. What's the driving? What are the factors that are involving that, or that are driving that?
As far as the weeds go, a lot of it has to do with weather and the ability of farmers to clear their fields, so to speak, because clearing fields after a harvest costs money. And as the input costs go up, they aren't able to as efficiently clear those fields. And what I mean by that is you go in and you burn those fields or you till them. And what happens is weeds are a problem. If it starts to be a problem this year, it's going to be a worse problem next year. It's one of those things. It's like a snowball effect. So, we've had some really, really bad weather years, which also doesn't help. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with the dicamba controversy and stuff like that. Weed control is a problem up here just as a general rule because the soil is so good in Northeast Arkansas. It's good for crops, but it's also good for weeds. And so as these input costs go up, farmers can't afford to be out there doing all this as much weed control as they would like. And so it's just a snowballing effect, and it's all coming together, this spring. Now, on the bright side of that, maybe not the bright side, but the fortunate side for Arkansas farmers is that, a lot of corn and wheat is grown in the Ukraine and Russia, and they are going to export quite a bit less, it's looking like, than they normally do, which is going to cause prices for corn and wheat to go up, commodities. And like soybeans right now, another staple crop in the state of Arkansas, we're looking at, record or near records for bushels right now. So the commodity prices are up, but the input costs are up too.
Okay, let's go back, if we can, to Mervin. Let's start with Mervin. Is this a result of consumer confidence? A lot of this federal money, we're not going to see as much federal money, are we, as we have in the past couple of years?
Well, I think when we're talking about fuel prices in particular, that we've seen an increase in fuel prices over the last year, and that was because people perceived it to be safer to travel more, and they were traveling more and spending more on fuel, and people are going back to work, going back to the offices, maybe not 5 days a week, maybe 3 days a week, but they are still driving more and commuting. So all of that contributes to fuel prices. That was even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that contributed even more to increased fuel prices. So I think consumer confidence is one of those indicators that's hard to read these days. At least since 2016, it's become a partisan consumer confidence. When there's a Republican administration, Democrats feel down in the dumps, and when there's a Democratic administration, Republicans feel down in the dumps. So it's hard to read that in any useful manner going forward. But I think just looking at people's behavior, and as Jeremy pointed out, people are spending more money in the economy, which indicates its own consumer confidence there.
Well, one thing we can read, and that's the Consumer Price Index, and Chairman Powell says we're not going to put up with very much of this. As a matter of fact, get ready, buckle your seatbelt, because it's going to go up again. The Fed's going to raise rates, I think at least twice more this year, he's projecting. What impact is that likely to have here?
Well,
Mervin, we'll start with you, Mervin. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was in the room, and when the question was asked, what's stopping you from a 0.5% rate hike, and he said nothing. And I think there was an audible gasp in the room. So I think when you look at the minutes of the Federal Reserve meeting from the last time, there were a lot of members that thought we should have raised by 0.5, but there were others that didn't want to because they were trying to wait to see what the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine would be on fuel prices and the contributing inflation from all of that. So it's very likely that we're going to see a higher rate hike in the next meeting, and I think we're looking at rate hikes at every time the Federal Reserve meets from here through to the end of the year and even longer. So the immediate impact, obviously, is that it increases the cost of borrowing, not only for banks but businesses as well. The Federal Reserve is also going to roll off buying mortgage-backed securities, and we've seen the mortgage rate, which was in the low 3% at the end of 2021, is now maybe 4.75 and headed towards 5%. So it should cool some of the home buying market as well here in Arkansas.
Yeah, Jeremy Horpedahl, your colleague Mervin's term was cool. Cool it down. Obviously, we don't want to freeze. Do you concur with him, or?
Yeah, I think the Fed is in a tight spot here. We've really had a roaring recovery since the bottoms of the pandemic, and almost all indicators looking great except for price inflation, which is extremely important, especially that consumer price inflation has been exceeding wage growth. And it's not just energy and gas prices. So even if you take those out of the equation, inflation's still been about 6% over the past year. So I think the Fed really knows that they need to start raising rates. They're cautious, though, to slow that roaring recovery too much and to send us into another recession. So I think they're looking at their toolkit and not wanting to raise too quickly, but I think it almost seems like they need to, but they're very hesitant to do that at this point. And so I think the smaller rate hikes throughout the rest of the year, like we're likely to see going forward.
Yeah, and as Mervin pointed out, interest rates, the housing sector, of course, feels that in an especially acute fashion.
Yeah, that's right. As the Fed raises the interest rates on their issues, we then see mortgage rates going up, and we've seen that as well. Mortgage rates have been stuck at kind of historic lows throughout most of the pandemic, but now they're starting to creep up again. And so anyone who refinanced at those lower costs took advantage of that. But as those rates go up, that could slow the housing market as well. We've seen significant growth, across the country, but even in Arkansas, which is often kind of insulated from these housing price bubbles, we have seen pretty significant increases in Arkansas. And so as we see those mortgage rates go up, that's going to potentially cool the housing market as well. But there's also just a lot of demand for people to move as people are changing jobs or people are working remotely and are just looking at a better place to live. And this is all going on at the same time. So it's a little hard to predict, but it's definitely something to watch.
Well, I mean, do you want to make a prediction? I mean, looking at the trend, as we noted, Mr. Powell says we're going to have some more, money's going to cost more as the year goes on. You want to make a prediction?
One prediction I'll make is that I think inflation is going to stay high for a while. We've had so much new money come in the past 2 years in terms of the Federal Reserve, expanding the money supply, increasing 40 to 50% by most measures of the money supply. We've had a lot of new money coming through federal stimulus. You also have a lot of states now talking about doing some sort of inflation or gas price stimulus. There hasn't been really much talk of that in Arkansas, but a lot of states are saying that. That's going to inject even more money into the system. So my one prediction is inflation is going to stay high for a while.
Mervin, I don't think you'll take issue with that.
No, I'm going to agree with that. I think inflation is going to stay high for a while, and I'd add a couple of more reasons. I think the war in Russia and Ukraine is going to continue for a while, and that's going to keep fuel prices, fertilizer prices, grain prices high. But in addition to that, we're starting to see, I think, lockdowns again in China. I think there are something like 23 cities currently under some form of lockdown, including several major manufacturing hubs. So we're going to have the supply chain issues that we tried to mitigate towards the end of last year reappear through this year, unless China changes their lockdown policy to deal with COVID. So for a variety of reasons, we're going to have elevated inflation through the rest of this year and probably a good part of next year as well.
I want to go back to George Jarrett up in Northeast Arkansas. My friend, Mervin just mentioned supply chain issues which bedevil the economy for the last, and consumers anyway, for the last couple of years. And they are, in fact, are they not starting to appear again? They're visible at the supermarket.
They're not appearing again. They just keep reappearing all the time. I talk to a lot of business owners, and, I talk to contractors who are, just building houses and things like that. They can't get windows. They can't get doors. I talked to a guy who owns several hotels. They have problems getting linens and shampoos. And when they can find stuff that they need, they tend to buy it in bulk as much as they can. So that just exacerbates the problem. Another problem that a lot of small businesses are having, in addition to the supply chain woes, which everything that I'm hearing is that they're not going to get any better, by the way, that they're going to continue on into the next quarter and probably the quarter after that. Another problem they're having is the labor force. I talked to a woman who runs a business here in town, and she said that for every 5 people that she hires, it used to be, she said, maybe 2 would be good workers and they would be, somebody that she would want to retain long term. And now she said she can hire 5 and within a week, all 5 are gone. And it's a real problem for businesses as far from a continuity standpoint. They don't, it costs money to train new people. And so they're continuously having to do that. And it's a real problem, As far as the interest rates going up, I don't know how much that's going to impact this part of the state right now. I'm sure it will when these further rates go up. I think the first round of rate increases, didn't affect too much. I talked to, several real estate, people who are doing some huge development projects right now. And so far, it's not hitting them too hard, but later on down the road, honestly, not being able to get doors and windows is a bigger problem from them at this point right now.
Well, let me start with George here on this one, or rather with Jeremy on this one. All the numbers, anyway, involving the labor market seem to be improving, and yet we have complaints persisting from the business community about hiring issues. Have we seen, and will we continue to see, the whole notion, the whole concept of labor shapeshift here? Jeremy?
Yeah, I think we're in an environment that we would call a very tight labor market, that there are just not enough people for all the jobs that businesses want to fill. For workers, this is actually great. This means businesses have to raise wages. And while I said that wages haven't been keeping up with inflation, at the bottom end, actually, wages have been. So at the middle of the income distribution, wages have been pretty close to inflation. But at the bottom, they've been shooting up high because, you drive around town anywhere and you see that, fast food restaurants saying, we're hiring $15 an hour plus bonuses. This is a challenge for businesses, especially because workers have lots of opportunities. They can switch jobs. But actually, wages at the bottom have been doing great. But I think that the comment that Jared made that employers are having trouble keeping people long term, that is a tough spot for businesses. But that's mostly because, for a variety of reasons, workers just have a lot more options today, and that's good. That's good for them.
Okay, and Mervin, let's try that same question to you. Are we seeing the whole notion of labor change?
Yeah, and as I pointed out earlier, there are some people that are not working because of childcare issues. There are some people that are not working because they retired early. And, I don't have any expectation that the childcare issues would improve anytime soon. So there's going to be a number of people out of the workforce that could be working that are going to remain that way. And the unretirement rate is improving. So I do see some prospect for improvement there. But on the other side of the equation, there's just a lot more demand for labor as well. In the last 2 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in new business applications here in the state of Arkansas and around the country as well. So a lot of these businesses might be sole proprietorships, but there are several of those businesses that hire other people. And so there's just more competition for labor in a situation where you have, some people not able to work or not working for other reasons.
Well, Mervin, we'll stay with you we've got about a minute remaining, I think, in the broadcast or in this segment. If you were a state legislator or an incumbent or an incoming governor, we don't know who that'll be, and you look at the Arkansas revenue picture as opposed to a world that is flat, to borrow a phrase, are you confident that that our economy is in good shape, that state government is in good shape fiscally?
Well, I think our state government is always conservatively budgeted, so we're not likely to, run into issues that other states might run into. But at the same time, as a result of that conservative budgeting, we've not been able to sort of make long-term investments that we might want to make in infrastructure or education, or pick a topic of any interest. So I think it's probably time during a proper legislative session to look at how we budget and how much money we build in surpluses every year, and then try to spend it ad hoc and think about how we should handle that money on a long-term basis.
A policy question, in fact. All right. Mervin, Jeremy, and George Jarrett, thanks very much for coming aboard. Thank you, and come back soon. And we'll be right back with Good Roots. If you think agriculture in Arkansas, you think soybeans, rice, corn, cotton, wheat, peanuts. But mushrooms? It's our Good Roots segment for April.
Major funding for Good Roots is provided by Arkansas Farm Bureau.
Arkansas Farm Bureau, advocating the interests of Arkansas's largest industry for more than 80 years. Arkansas counts on agriculture. Agriculture counts on Farm Bureau.
Additional funding for Good Roots provided by the Union Pacific Foundation.
People will always, at farmers market, they'll have a picture or something that, a mushroom that's growing in their yard that they want to know what it is. I'm not great at identifying, all the different species of mushrooms. I know what we grow, but I always tell people that all mushrooms are edible. Some are just edible once. My name is Trey Balcom, and I'm a mushroom farmer.
My name is Zach Taylor. I'm a mushroom farmer, and I live in Northwest Arkansas.
We both lived in South Arkansas, and we moved up here, and we were just really kind of in love with the community. We were walking around the farmer's market one day, and we thought, hey, we could be the mushroom guys. There's nobody doing it. And we didn't know what the yields were. We didn't know if it'd be profitable. So we just decided to do it at least as a hobby. And it kind of mushroomed into a business. Bad mushroom jokes. This time of year at Fat Top Farm, we grow 6 types of mushroom. This is a golden oyster. It's got a real distinctive flavor and taste. When you eat them raw, they almost have like a melon taste. Chestnut mushrooms, they have a kind of a nutty flavor. They hold their texture really well. They're my favorite mushroom to put on a pizza. This is a pink oyster mushroom. They're a tropical mushroom. They have a meatiness similar to Canadian bacon. This is a blue oyster mushroom. They're our favorite mushroom to grow. They have the best shelf life. They taste great. If we had to grow one mushroom at Fat Top Farm, it would be blue oyster mushrooms. The best thing about being a mushroom farmer is influencing the way people eat, expanding people's horizons just a little bit.
When I was a kid, at least in the single digits, I didn't like mushrooms. I thought they only came from a can, and I didn't like them at all. One time my mom she's really good at getting me to try stuff. And she had made some fried mushrooms, and she was like, you gotta try one. Just have an open mind. I did what she said. I tried to forget what I thought before about mushrooms and just focus only on this experience right now. And I liked it. And I was like, wow. So fast forward, and just never lost the bug after that.
We grow off of stuff that would be considered waste. It's soy hulls and sawdust and water. That's it.
And that's what mushrooms like to grow on. That's what most things like to grow in. They all look like this once they've soaked up the water.
And you can see where they're starting, that mushroom mycelium is starting to leap off or expand. This bag right here, it's almost fully colonized, or maybe it is fully colonized. It's ready for fruiting. Most everything out here is redneck engineered. We built it ourselves.
They spend most of their life in more of a warm environment, incubating. And when they're all colonized, we move them into this room, which is cool, wet, and the lights on. And those are all 3 kind of triggers to make them want to produce mushrooms. This is probably 4 or 5 days into the process, but it all depends on the temperature.
They'll practically double in size every 24 hours at this point. And it's kind of magical watching them. With varying demand, with farmers markets raining out occasionally, or chefs canceling orders last minute, we find it hard to exactly meet demand. And so we overcame that by processing our mushrooms, by making food products. Essentially how it works is we take the caps, we cut them off, and we make jerky with them. And the stems we roast and we make broth out of it. So nothing goes to waste. That's a big deal for us.
And this is all thanks to the Arkansas Food Innovation Center at the University of Arkansas. They've been great to us as well.
We're a state-certified shared-use kitchen. We provide this service to the general community for them to make retail products. Our #1 goal is food safety. We teach them all about that. Each product that Trey does has a unique process.
So what we'll do now is we'll add a little bit of our sauce and these mushroom caps, and they'll cook for about 45 minutes. The sauce is a mixture of tamari, which is a gluten-free soy sauce, brown sugar, and apple cider vinegar. So we'll add these mushrooms to this liquid that's in the kettle. So we'll just spread this out thin, and it'll go in the dehydrator and it'll come out looking like this over here. Having an influence on the way people eat is kind of a big deal. Being at the farmer's market here, and I've never seen that before, hearing that 100 times a day, it's what makes you keep going when you're not making a lot of money or, you know, can't afford to pay yourself. Those are the things that keep you going. I'd like to see us in a couple hundred grocery stores with our packaged products.
At that point, you're doing more than just feeding your local community. You may be putting yourself out there to the rest of the world, and that's kind of a big deal. Don't be afraid to experiment with our mushrooms. You can do anything you want with them. If you like soup, drop them into soup. If you like fried mushrooms, fry them up. Just want to tell the world to eat more mushrooms.
And that does it for us for this week. Thanks as always for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.